All right, welcome everybody. All right, we'll just give a minute for everyone to come in from the waiting room here. And good morning. Good morning for most of you. Good afternoon, evening for our guest who's in Israel. Um, Welcome everyone. My name is Alan Levine. I'm CEO of Hasbara Fellowships. For those who are newer to our work, we do pro-Israel work and battle anti-Semitism on college campuses, and we do so primarily by training student leaders, and we do that by taking them to Israel. And we're known for our Hasbara Fellowships student leadership missions to Israel, and we work with students especially on those missions every summer, every winter break. And then when they're back on campuses, our students are leaders in the pro-Israel movements on their campuses. They bring in guest speakers, they write op-eds, work with student government, and in an effort to stand up to the anti-Israel propaganda and the rising surge of anti-Semitism, we want to stay informed and we need to be up to date of what's happening. And Obviously, no issue right now is more important than the war in Iran. Uh, and To discuss it, we have one of our favorite educators, Elliot Chodoff. Elliot, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks. Elliot is a major, still active in the reserves, major of the IDF, former professor of military science at the University of Haifa. And if I may add, my favorite part of your bio, frequent speaker for Hasbara student missions to Israel. Almost every time, or at least every time we can get you if you're in the country and you're not on a
Yes.
speaking tour somewhere. So thanks for doing this. And on these leadership sessions, just before we jump in, we cover different topics, and we've had Elliot from time to time, and we've had others who have other areas of expertise. But with this war in Iran, you've been our speaker three times in a row now, and with your military expertise, this is, I think, a very military heavy time, and I think there are obviously other aspects of the Iran war too. The diplomatic aspect, we're very much focused on the social media environment around it. But I think what most people in our community really need to understand right now is exactly what is going on, and just how you analyze it and read the situation with from a military perspective. And so we're hoping you can start with that. And maybe, I guess my first question for you, Elliot, is what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, and what else is happening generally in the bigger picture right now?
Okay. The Straits of Hormuz are currently under what I guess is best referred to as a double blockade, which in and of itself is kind of interesting. Let me start with the Iranian one because it starts with that. First of all, let's understand that this is not the first time Iran has blocked or blockaded the Straits. The Straits of Hormuz are a natural choke point for Iran to use to its advantage, and uh, if for no other reason, an enormous amount. The percentages aren't that important because percentages shift, but an enormous amount of crude oil comes out through the straits by tanker and out to the rest of the world. And the Iranian coast is one side of the Straits of Hormuz. They did it back in the 70s. They've done it. They've done it since. I'm sorry, the 80s. And they've done it since. The threat has always been there. And the idea that they just woke up last week or 2 weeks ago and said, "Hey, why don't we blockade the straits?" And somehow dumping it on something unique about this war or Trump is simply nonsense. It's unconnected to reality. That's first and foremost. Second, I think important to understand the Straits of Hormuz is an international waterway. The Iranians desperately would like it declared Iranian water. And that's the whole idea behind them wanting to charge a toll going through there. Because if that is established, first of all, it would be a unique case in international maritime law that a major artery that goes from one international body of water to another, even when it goes through the territorial waters of a country, that it would not be considered international waters. And the most obvious that has been recognized for centuries is the Bosporus, the exit from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean that goes through Turkey. Now, I'll just say this as an aside, it would not shock me in the least that the Turks are helping prod the Iranians in that direction to give them an excuse to do the same thing in the Bosporus, but that's my personal sort of side opinion. That's number one. The Iranian blockade is pure threat in terms of its danger. They've dropped a number of mines. It's not clear how many, but not a huge number. They claim to have dropped mines in the straits that they cannot track, which also tells us that this is not a diplomatic move. In other words, you don't do something irrevocable when you're doing it for diplomatic purposes, because if you can't revoke what you've done, it has no diplomatic weight. And they've done it, and now they say there's nothing we can do about it. Too bad. And since they're lacking a navy, thanks to this last war, they're using what's left of their fast boat fleet to attack ships, and in some cases actually board them and take them over. Now, the real threat that's blockading the straits is the secondary threat, or the consequential threat, of what the Iranians are doing. In other words, they don't have enough force, mines or fast boats, to actually stop a significant number of ships going through the straits. What they have done, though, is made the insurance companies forbid the passage of those ships in the straits. In other words, the real blockade is being done by the insurance companies, who are telling the ship owners, we will not insure your ships if they try to run the blockade. And that's basically shut the straits. And it will take an enormous amount of naval power at high risk to reopen those straits, whether it's American plus European, American plus anybody else, because in particular here the Iranians have an advantage, and that is a naval force like an aircraft carrier task force is strangled in the straits. The U.S. Navy is meant to operate in oceans, not in narrow bodies of water. So going in there would be a mistake. Sending in a few destroyers, which has been done, makes sense, but that's not enough force to really cover the straits to the level, and I'm going to say this again, to the level that the insurance companies will tell the ship owners, we'll cover you going through. Okay, and that should be sort of the watchword here. It's not the overwhelming physical threat of the Iranians, but the sufficient threat. And I'm not criticizing the insurance companies. I'm simply saying that they have raised it to the point where economically the insurance companies are shutting it down. They're doing the job.
If I could just clarify what we're saying here, in other words, last time we met, you talked about harassment fire. The idea that
Correct.
the Iranians can have just a few missiles left, and if they can just shoot one and harass people in Israel or in the Gulf for that matter, that's kind of enough to keep, to meet certain objectives and to keep them relevant, as it were. And
Correct.
so same thing here, if they can pick off one or two boats here and there, sort of, which is the old terrorism tactic, right? Just
right.
Make everyone afraid, and then insurance companies don't participate, and that's all they need to achieve their objective.
Yes, here it's in an absolute sense. In other words, when the insurance companies say we're not covering you, they've essentially closed the straits. But the terrorism analogy is a very good one. We can go back to 9/11 and the period of hijacking airplanes, and of course 9/11 using them as weapons. The I don't, I have to say this as an aside. Whenever you talk about war, whether it's terrorist war or conventional war or whatever, uh, there's always the risk of sounding like you're not taking the real damage seriously. So I want to make clear that when I'm speaking here in military terms, it's not that I'm denigrating or poo-pooing the actual damage or the casualties that were caused. But 9/11, for all of its damage, had an enormous ripple effect. TSA, delays, security that we're still paying for to this day, and it costs a fortune to prevent 9/11 from happening again. So terrorism has that kind of effect. I remember, I'll date myself, the first time I flew to Israel was in 1972. There was no security.
Really?
There was El Al security and the minimum level of interviewing you. Hi, how are you? Who are you? Where are you going? Have a nice flight.
Mm.
And and we bring it up to where we are today. That's the consequence of terrorism, and that's call it the secondary and tertiary damage that terrorism has done in terms of the cost of security, the cost tertiary. How many work hours cumulative does it cost the United States having to get to the airport an extra hour or two earlier because of security?
Mm. Right.
Even with TSA pre-check and clear and schmear and all of that.
Right.
Okay. So here, very similar. Again, good analogy, except in this case it's absolute. The actual level of Iranian threat is not that high. Of course, it's easy for me to say sitting here and not on a ship in the Straits, but it's not that high in military terms. But it's high enough to be a financial threat to the level that the insurance companies say we're not going to insure it. This falls under the active war clause or whatever their technical way of doing it. And the owners say, okay, we're not running the Straits. It's as simple as that. And if you can't guarantee, in other words, if the United States, and it can't guarantee, if you can't guarantee safe passage, we'll wait.
Right.
And it's on you.
And no, and so thank you, Michael, for your question. And Michael wrote a question in the chats, which it's like he read my mind. That was going to be my question too, which is, can the U.S. government or a government or governments take over the insurance, provide the insurance? Is that
No, it's way,
that
way,
even
way
in the
way too
discussion?
much money.
Uh,
Way too much money.
mhm.
And it would be a bad precedent. No, what can be done? There are tactically there are a few things that can be done. One is the second blockade. In other words,
Brings us to what is
what
being done,
what
which is the U.S. blockade.
exactly. In other words, what the U.S. basically said is, all right, if we can't stop you, we'll raise you one and slap you with it with one on top, and let's see who can last longer.
Right.
And
And I wanted to ask you about that, Elliot, because I think a lot of people, since this was announced, what, a week ago, um, are saying, well, what is this? What is a blockade of a blockade? And maybe if you could tell me whether I'm on the right track here, and I'm gonna, as a parent of young toddlers, I'll put it in, I'll use a kindergarten analogy. If you say, if a
okay,
kindergartner says, no one is allowed to use the swing, and then the teacher says, well, we're just gonna, or some other kid says, I'm going to stop everyone at the entrance to the playground. And now you're not going to be able to stop anyone. You're not going to be able to choose which of your friends use the swing. I'm just blocking the entire playground. And now you're just on your own. Is that more or less the right analogy here?
no, but
No.
I'll use your analogy. It's the kid who says only my friends can use the swing, nobody else can use the playground.
Right.
And you come and say, well, if that's the case, nobody can use the swing either.
Right. Mm.
Okay. In other words, it's kind of reversed. But the it is coincidence. I'll call it's not 100%, but it's coincidence that Iran's largest port, Bandar Abbas, is in the Straits of Hormuz. So what America is actually doing is not blockading the straits, it's blockading the port.
Oh, okay.
Okay, that happens to be in the straits. And what Iran was basically saying is we're blockading the straits to anybody except those who we permit through. And America, but our ships are going to come and go freely, and ships to us are going to come and go freely. And we're going to ship out oil against sanctions to China and all that thought because China is an important element in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
But we're going to keep doing business as usual and prevent you from doing it. And America comes along and says, you're going to stop us, we'll stop you. And we're going to stop you totally and permanently. Again, let's keep in mind that as painful as it might be, the amount of oil that comes through the straits is 20%, they say, 15%, whatever it is, of world consumption. The Saudis are now starting to pump in the direction of the Red Sea. In other words, they're going to lessen that as well. There are other alternatives where they can be kicked in weeks or months or whatever. The Straits of Hormuz can be reduced significantly in their importance.
Mm-hmm.
Bandar Abbas is their port. They have no other choice. Mm-hmm. So shutting that down strangles them. And Trump is playing on that. He's talking about it costing them, $400-500 million a day. I haven't seen any argument against those numbers. So for a country that is already was in an economic catastrophic position 3-4 months ago, right, worse after the war, and now getting strangled to the tune of $500 million a day, it's going to be interesting to see how long they can hold out before they break.
Why wasn't this done from day one of the war?
I think there was a miscalculation.
Sorry?
I think there was a miscalculation. And that miscalculation is a classic Western miscalculation that's been made repeatedly. And we made it with Hamas, we've made it with Hezbollah. Ideological regimes cannot be coerced with force. They can be micro-coerced. In other words, you can tell them, like we did with Hamas and Hezbollah for a number of years at a time, if you fire at us, we will blast you. They said, all right, you know what? We don't have enough strength to do it now. We'll wait. That level of coercion works. But once it goes to full scale, which is what happened when this round started on February 28th, the idea was, we're going to beat them up for a week or two, and we will beat sense into them. We're going to take out the radicals, as if they're radicals and moderates, and they're still talking in that kind of terminology today, which has no anchor in reality. But we're going to take out the radicals and the extremists, and then the moderates are going to come to terms, and they're going to make a deal, and everything's going to work. And we don't need to full court press it because they'll see the light. They'll understand. They'll understand not only what we've done to them, but based on what we've done, they will understand what we can do. In other words, there was a combination in the first weeks of doing real damage, but at the same time doing what's in the diplomacy and international relations terminology is signaling. In other words, understand not only what we're doing to you, but what we're capable of doing to you. Take that into account, be reasonable, come to terms now, and prevent all of this from happening to you. I am not aware of a hardcore ideological totalitarian regime, state or non-state, that has ever worked on. Okay, in part because they have very, very little, if any, interest in the well-being of their population. Their regime and its survival is more important to them than anything else. And if you add the radical Islamic, twist to it, even more than their lives. Okay, right. All right, I can use say the Nazi Germany analogy, and I can use it advisedly. But the Nazi Germany analogy, Also, Hitler and friends were willing to run Germany completely into the ground because their interest in the well-being of Germany, once it started to lose the war, disappeared entirely, but their lives mattered to them. Here, their lives don't matter that much to them. So there's another element that's taken out of the coercion picture. All of this, I believe, was miscalculated, discounted in the planning of going into this war.
Hmm. And so, what do you, what's the, at this point, from what you're seeing, and I guess this will be more of a political question than a military one, but what is the end game at this point? You kind of hear some people, I think I heard Tal Becker say, the goal here was and is to diminish or remove the Iranian regime's ability to wage war. So it's about basically the weapons. Take out the nuclear program, take out the missiles. We don't, we can't control who's in charge and what they'll do in the long-term future, but for now, they're not going to have the ability to wage war. It's kind of sounds like one argument. And then I think most of us, at least someplace in our hearts, want the Iranian people to control their country again and have a new regime. Everyone would love that, and of course. But what do you think is the end game now?
I don't know what the end game is now. I will say that an end game that does not include some path mechanism to regime change is a failed strategy.
Hmm.
Now, here I want to be clear, not every mechanism and not every path and not every strategy succeeds. So having one doesn't mean you're necessarily going to achieve what you're aiming for. But the aim should be the overthrowing of this regime by its population, by its own citizens, with assistance, without assistance. It's going to have to be with assistance of one type or another. But ultimately, this regime has got to be removed and not shifting pieces within the regime, which is what Trump has been talking about. With there's a whole new regime in there because we killed off every. No. This is internal shifts of the same characters,
Right.
and we're seeing it today. Uh, the so-called IRGC hardliners versus the parliamentary and presidential moderates. It's nonsense.
Right.
The government people, the president and the parliament people, are perhaps a little bit more physically pragmatic and a little bit less hardcore ideological, but that's a question of degrees. And once again, I'll go back to the Nazi Germany picture. Hitler, in the last months of the war, ordered his Minister of Industries, Albert Speer, to destroy all of Germany's infrastructure, which would lead to the utter annihilation of the German population, because he said that the German people showed themselves to be not worthy of survival because they lost the war. Speer, who was a hardcore, out and out Nazi, refused to do it because he was a Western liberal Democrat? No, because he took a different view of the value of the population, and he was, call it, more pragmatic. I can give you other examples, but I think that's a working one.
Hmm.
What we have today is two factions, apparently. A supreme leader, so to speak, who's incapable of transmitting any sort of decisions in an organized fashion for a whole bunch of reasons.
Mhm.
But in both cases of the so-called pragmatists and the so-called radicals, nobody who is going to negotiate their own demise. And therefore, it's got to be some sort of an overthrow. If we recede from that, if we retreat from that to military victory, all we've done is kick the can down the road. They will rebuild, whether it takes them 3, 5, 7 years, with the Chinese, with the Turks, without these are the Russians. These are all open questions.
Right.
But leaving them in place means having to face this problem on steroids 5 to 10 years down the road.
Right. And it faces some resistance politically here. It's somewhat unpopular to talk about regime change, but those of us who've been working on this issue for a couple of decades know how how bad the Iranian regime is, and regime change, of course, is what we want to see. Is the double
If I
blockade
could
possibly a mechanism
wait,
to
let me.
go ahead?
I want to interject something because I think it's important. Regime change has a bad name in the U.S. for good reason,
Right.
and in particular the Iraq, but also the Afghanistan, particularly the Iraq war model,
Right.
which was flawed from day one and got worse as it went on. It was, I mean, even the military aspects of it were poorly planned, but managed to be pulled off. The political aftermath, the so-called nation building, the democracy idea, and all of that was going to be somehow imposed, facilitated by the United States, was completely detached from reality from day one, and it failed predictably. The idea of doing the same thing in Iran would be folly, but that doesn't mean that overturning a regime using the local population is the same thing. It just has this, it's the same sort of headline labeling, but it's an
Right.
entirely different technique on
Right.
its basis.
Right. As you always say, the
Now,
yeah, if you look at the headlines and you look at the social media, you're looking on a very superficial level, and that's well put. It looks like the same labeling on the headline, but you open the can and it's a whole different can of beans
correct.
in there. So, right.
Yes.
Well, is the double blockade possibly a mechanism? Can it last until there's regime change? I mean, it sounds like it would be choking the regime, right? I mean, is it possible to have it last months and months until the regime's
Look,
so weak they can't find themselves? Is
the
that possible?
blockade can last. The question here again, the regime is not going to collapse of its own weight. Uh, and once again, I'll come back to the German case. The Nazi regime continued to operate for a week and a half after Berlin fell. Okay, but if we go back to the Hitler suicide period at the end of April, they were operating. They had nothing left to operate with, but they were
Right.
operating
Mhm.
because they weren't going to quit. They had there was no way for them to quit.
Mhm.
What didn't happen in Germany was that was a popular uprising. There was the mini attempt in July 1944, that on July 20th that Tom Cruise managed to get a movie out of.
Mhm.
But there was no popular turn against the Nazis till through the end. What we're talking about here is something else. Not convincing the regime that it needs to go, but convincing the opposition in the population that it can rise up and overthrow the regime. And it's a tricky business. It's not an A to B to C to D kind of thing. It's amorphous.
Right.
I would be shocked if the CIA and the Mossad are not in there operating and
Mhm.
organizing and facilitating, and others perhaps, but those two come to mind off the top of my head. But ultimately, it will have to be the Iranian people who do it. And I don't know that the blockade per se will be the event trigger, but it is certainly helping to degrade the power of the regime to make it more susceptible to an overthrow.
And what do you make of this? I've seen some analysis of the idea that the oil wells could dry up as a result of the blockade. right? If the Iranian regime no longer if it can't ship oil, then its storage facilities will be filled up, which then means they can't drill, or if they drill, there's nowhere to put the oil. And if you don't drill there for technical reasons, if you don't drill in an oil well, it could dry up and then no longer be used in operation, I think permanently, if I understand the technicalities of it correctly. Have you
Even
been aware of this? Is that a factor here?
I've read look I've read some stuff on it. I haven't gone into it in depth. All I'll say is this: even if an oil well ceases to be usable, the oil fields continue to exist.
Mm,
So at worst, I mean, the idea that all the oil down there is going to dry up if you don't pump it out, it's been there for a zillion years. It's not going away because nobody's touching it for 6 months.
right.
Uh, what it means is if that's true, and I have no way of verifying. Like I said, I've read a bit about it. It's not my field on a technical level. There's so much scare nonsense out there that I take it with a certain grain of salt. But okay, let's take it for a moment as a serious issue. The fields will be there. So it'll take another however long to drop more wells in to pump out.
Mm,
That becomes a technical issue. The amount of damage that's being done to Iran is going to take years to rebuild anyway. So this will be part of it. The other thing to keep in mind is whatever the Iranians are not pumping out of the ground has no effect on the world economy. All that oil, almost all of that oil, is being used either in Iran or is being shipped illegally to China.
right.
So
Right. Of
that
course.
brings us back to, who's going to suffer from it? It's not going to be the United States
Right.
or Europe.
What I was hoping for is that the Iranian regime suffers from it. Is the hope here, right? That
The Iranian,
I wonder if it's a mechanism to for for getting closer to regime change
no,
or
the
weakening the
no,
regime.
the Iranian regime is suffering directly from the blockade. That would be a tertiary suffering that might hurt it a year down the road,
Mhm.
2 years down the road. This is always an issue in strategy, political and military strategy. Uh, what do you aim at in terms of damage? If you can go across the board, so much the better. In other words, the immediate, the short term, the long term, and the far down the road long term. If you can strike all of those at once, you're in very good shape. But if you have to choose between them, you have to keep in mind that the longer term damage you do, the less impact it has on the immediate.
Right. I'm going to switch gears and talk about your neighborhood a little bit. Your actual
Okay.
neighborhood, which is your not so lovely neighbors Hezbollah. Since you're at
Back here
home,
somewhere, yeah.
right. Since you're at your home in northern Israel, t talk to us about that. I mean, it seems like a moment we've been waiting for. That perhaps that in Washington you've got the Lebanese government openly meeting with Israel, and you've got almost an admission from them. They're almost saying it out loud. It sounds like that Hezbollah is well an occupying force, an Iranian occupying force in southern Lebanon, and at least Israeli ambassador said we're on the same side of this.
Right.
What do you make of that? Will it go places? Is Hezbollah weakened enough that it can we can make some headway on that?
Hezbollah is not yet weakened enough, although it's been considerably weakened. I think here we've got to understand the creation of Hezbollah by Iran in the aftermath of the Khomeini takeover in 1979 was to insert a Khomeiniist terrorist organization into Lebanon. And I use the word Khomeiniist and not Shiite because there was already a Shiite organization,
Hmm.
militia, called Amal, which still exists to this day. And Amal didn't serve the purpose of the Khomeini regime because they weren't Khomeiniist.
Hmm.
And okay, this is a fine point that bears 2 minutes of focus, because one of the great errors in Western thinking is that in Islam there's the Sunnis versus the Shiites, and they hate each other and they don't talk to each other and they're killing each other, which is not really true. I mean, it's kind of true, but it's not really true. And the second is that the Shiites are this sort of monolith. And if they're not, well, there are the Twelver Shiites, and they're a monolith. And that's not true because within the Twelver Shiites, there are Khomeinists and non-Khomeinists. So Amal is a Twelver Shiite non-Khomeiniist organization, militia, Lebanese. Along comes Hezbollah, created by the Iranians in Lebanon to be their arm as a Khomeiniist Shiite organization. That's number one. Number two, there's a civil war going on. It started in the 70s. In 1989, it ends in an agreement in Taif called the Taif Agreement in Saudi Arabia, heavily influenced by the Syrians, who were allied with the Iranians and therefore backing Hezbollah. And the agreement at Taif, and this is critical in understanding where we are today in Lebanon, the Taif Agreement called for the disarming of all ethnic militias in Lebanon. Sunni, Christian, Shiite, everybody, Druze, everybody. Now, they didn't really do it, but they did it in large part. It was an agreement. Hezbollah was explicitly exempt from disarming because it was not considered to be an ethnic Lebanese militia, but rather a resistant organization fighting Israel.
Mm.
And the result of that is that into the 90s and 2000s and up until today, there's only one armed militia in Lebanon, and that's Hezbollah.
Mm.
Okay, and there's the Lebanese army, which is weaker than Hezbollah. This has been the situation now for decades. The consequence of that is that all these groups that nominally hate Hezbollah, the Christians, the Sunnis, the Druze, and Amal, have gone along with Hezbollah because if they don't, Hezbollah will kill them.
Right.
Now, in the past few years, Hezbollah has been radically, severely weakened by Israeli operations. I'm not going to review everything going back to October 7th, but we've basically beaten them to a pulp, but not defeated them. They're an extremely resilient organization. The Iranians continue to support them monetarily, physically, up until now, essentially, till this last round, February from March. And they remained reasonably powerful, although much, 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 much weaker than they were. The president of Lebanon, Aoun, is a Christian. He's a former chief of staff of the Lebanese army. He would desperately like to get rid of Hezbollah because Hezbollah threatens his sovereignty. And now, for the first time since 1989, there's some light on the horizon. The big problem that he has, and he's always had, and you know, when you come down to it, if it gets down to a fight, the fight becomes the arbiter. You don't know what the outcome is going to be until the fight is over. He would love to be able to order his army to disarm Hezbollah and disband it. He has two problems with his army. The first problem is that it's made up largely of Shiites, and their loyalty to the state versus Hezbollah is questionable. In other words, will they follow orders or will they mutiny?
Mm.
The second question is, if they follow orders, can they actually defeat Hezbollah? And I am willing to bet, and I'm not a betting man, but I'm willing to bet that he doesn't want to know the answer to those questions right now.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because the wrong answer to either of them, and he's in worse shape than he is right now.
Right. But from Israel's perspective, I mean, I think no one's counting on the Lebanese state to defeat Hezbollah, right? From Israel's perspective, it's the IDF is defending us from Hezbollah, right? But there's obviously now
for sure
a political diplomatic maneuver here, or an offensive or an initiative, right?
Right.
What's the goal of it now? I mean, if really the future is just holding pattern, which we're in a better situation than before October 7th, right? The IDF controls several hilltops in Lebanon.
Absolutely.
IDF.
Oh no, we control virtually all of South Lebanon right now.
Right. Right. And I mean, I last time we were up there with you, we saw you the next day, but we were about with the Amia Center on Kibbutz Mizgav
Right.
Am. We took the binoculars and we looked into Lebanon, and you see,
Sure.
and I remember we used to be up there with you 10 years ago, and you see the Hezbollah flags. You
That's right.
sometimes saw some Hezbollah people with binoculars on going in and out of houses. Of course,
Right.
as we know, they're terrorists and they put their weapons in homes, right? Not in a traditional base, right? And so we used to see all of that. But last time we were there, it's quite destroyed, right? So I think from a defense perspective, Israel's in pretty good shape right now. I mean, the IDF can go in and out and take people out. So what are we trying to achieve here politically with
Okay.
these negotiations in Washington between Lebanon and Israel?
Okay. So first of all, what you describe is correct, but it's a snapshot.
We only have a few minutes, so
Okay.
I'm being brief.
No. When I say what I mean by a snapshot, it's the picture right now.
Yes, yes,
Tomorrow's another day,
right.
and the first rule that we need to understand that this is true there, it's true in Gaza as well, that an army on the defensive that is not maneuvering hands the initiative over to the enemy. Now, in Gaza, Hamas is sufficiently weakened and licking its wounds that it's not a particular threat at the moment. Hezbollah continues to be a threat on a tactical level, and we're seeing it. They fired an anti-tank missile today at Israeli forces. They've started firing rockets again. Did somebody mention ceasefire? Well, you know my definition of a ceasefire with these guys. We cease, they fire,
Right.
and it's already happening. One of the things that was touted about this ceasefire and this new security zone in South Lebanon, unlike the last time between 1982 and 2000, the security zone that I always referred to, and I think you've heard me say this, as the insecurity zone. Um, Today it's going to be it's without population. We've driven the population north of Litani and we blew all the bridges, and now it's a deep populated zone except for Christian villages where we've allowed people to remain. Except the morning after the ceasefire, they rebuilt two of the bridges, and thousands of Lebanese Shiites are now moving back into South Lebanon. There is no such thing as a static situation.
Mhm.
So either we're going to maintain 4 or 5 divisions in Lebanon, which is absurd. It means keeping the reserves on a war footing indefinitely will ultimately wreck the economy, to say nothing of the physical and psychological effect of it all.
Mhm.
Uh, this is not the answer. This is the answer for this month.
Mhm.
And ultimately, I would say the end game with Lebanon, tacit, explicit, to work out an agreement where we, in conjunction with the Lebanese army, will destroy Hezbollah. Whether we do it, I don't believe we'll be able to do it in coordination on the ground, but coordination of backing their operations with air and artillery, which, by the way, we did with the Egyptian army in Sinai over the past decade, prior to October 7th, in their fight against Al Qaeda and ISIS and all sorts of other characters who were running around in Sinai. The Israeli Air Force was flying close support airstrikes for the Egyptian army being called in by Egyptian officers.
Mhm. Didn't know that.
And it worked. It was very effective.
And is
So
there real military value to that? That the Lebanese army could do that if it has Israeli backing? And is that the end game to just, in other
look,
words, to
have,
take some of the burden off the
if
IDF and have,
yeah, first of all, let them clean up their own country. Number one, this is sort of a variation on
except their country's
Iran.
your backyard, and wouldn't you trust the IDF to do it more than them?
No, because we're not going to take over the country. The only way to look, if as we drive north, Hezbollah flees north. So what? We're going to take over all of Lebanon. We took over too much of it already in 1982, and it was a failed operation. Ultimately, militarily, it was successful. It has echoes of Iraq and Afghanistan. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to strengthen an independent Lebanon back it as best we can. Now, again, if the army mutinies, then there's nothing you can do. Lebanon falls apart; it becomes a failed state, and we have to go to Plan B, whatever that is. But Plan A, as far as I'm concerned, is work it out with them. We have no territorial dispute with Lebanon. They're like 15 points along the border that totally come to the size of a couple of football fields. That's not what is standing between Israel and Lebanon in peace. So they're going to have to also decide what they want to be when they grow up. Do they want to be an independent country that rules themselves, or do they want to continue to be a basket case of ethnic strife and Iranian meddling?
A lot to think about. I'll take a couple of questions from everyone, which we have a couple in the chat. And if you have questions, please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand, which you can do at the bottom of your screen if you click on React. And if you raise your hand, we'll take a couple of questions. So
Yes.
we're switching gears. So Ella, thanks, Ella. Ella Friedman asks about the recent incident in South Lebanon. IDF soldier, unfortunately, defacing and destroying a statue of Jesus in a Christian village there. Any thoughts
Yeah, Bill.
on that?
Yes. Thoughts beyond disgusting. Look, first of all, as usual, let me start with the flip end of it before I get to what actually happened. As usual, a Jewish individual does something, and the entire Jewish people is responsible for it. Sorry, I can't get terribly excited over that. Second, I don't subscribe to the argument, look at all the terrible things the Christians have done to us over the years. What do you want from us? That's nonsense. What I see is a soldier violating myriad regulations, including issues of morality, but also other regulations, who, in my opinion, didn't get sufficient prison time for what he did. And I'm not quite sure why, but I can guess that it had to do with the fact that he was what he did. Let me see if I can explain this quickly. Military law, Israeli, American, and otherwise, is divided up into segments. And I'll use the Israeli case because the American one is a little more complicated. When you violate a military law, you can either be brought up in front of, for lack of a better term, as a disciplinary court-martial, or if you actually commit a crime, you can go before a military court. Military disciplinary courts martial are limited in the sentencing they can give, although with a bit of creativity, and I say this as somebody who sat on them and has prosecuted disciplinary courts, you can actually rack up some decent punishment, but you have to be creative about it. Whoever prosecuted him in the disciplinary court was not creative, and I don't think there was any malice involved. I just think that they took a simplistic view of how to deal with it. They threw the maximum they could think of at him, and he got the maximum they could give him under the circumstances. What he did was despicable. It was the act of essentially two individuals, and I'm not going to try to excuse it. I can talk about an individual in an army that's over 500,000 strong. I can talk about stress. I can talk about background. I can talk about the fact that Israeli military discipline, much to my chagrin, is not at the level I would like to see it, and military discipline in general in the IDF. Here's a teaser. I just did a podcast today. For those who are not familiar, I have a podcast called Conflict Uncovered. I did one today that is the first installment of what I'm calling the long road to October 7th. And part of the disciplinary issues of the IDF go back to an organization called the Palmach. And those who aren't familiar, I suggest you take a look at it and study. Wonderful boys and girls, tremendously motivated. Discipline was not their strong suit. And the IDF still suffers from an element of that. So I see all of those things. I see no mitigation. I see no argument for anything other than condemnation. But at the same time, to say there was one guy who did it, another guy who took pictures of it, who videoed it. They were both stupid enough to put it up on wherever they put it, so the world could see it. Um, Beyond that, I'm speechless.
Right.
Except that minimally they got what they deserved in the sense that they were prosecuted, convicted, and sentenced.
And they are in jail, right? They did in military prison,
Yes,
right? Which
yes,
which if I could just add from our perspective, since we're our students are getting this kind of question on campus. It's been all over the press, of course. I
of
think
course,
that's the key point. It was condemned by the prime minister, condemned by the foreign minister. That soldiers that responsible are in prison, and that's the difference between a democracy and uh, everyone else
absolutely.
in the neighborhood. And
I
it is the policy of Iran and of Hezbollah and of Hamas and really of all of Israel's enemies too. It is a policy, not a an aberration or an exception to the rule. So it's their policy to oppress Christians and Jews and Muslims who don't agree with them. Uh,
absolutely.
Israel is a democracy, and you just have to visit one time to see the flourishing of all three monotheistic faiths in the old city of Jerusalem. And that didn't happen
I
under anyone except for
no.
Israeli since Israel
I,
liberated the city of Jerusalem. So, sorry, go
I
ahead.
want to add. I want to add one more point to this because I think it's important. It applies to many other things as well. Uh, and Americans, I think, are particularly susceptible to this because of the limited number of Americans who serve in the military. Military law is different from civilian law. And I won't go into all the details because it's very complex, but I'll put it in these terms. When you give somebody a weapon and send them into the battlefield with orders to shoot and destroy, and again, I'm orders, not blow up whatever you want and shoot whatever you want, but you're sending them out there into danger with orders to shoot, kill, and destroy. The rules of their behavior are different from those of the average person walking down the street of hometown USA. And they are prosecuted differently and they are judged differently because much of what they're doing under orders would be against the law if they were civilians in hometown USA. And that's an important point of understanding because people are, well, look, he did this. Why wasn't he prosecuted for this? Because the world is different in the military combat setting.
Makes sense. We promised everyone 1 hour, which gives us time for just a couple more questions, which I'll ask both of them
Okay.
here in rapid fire style here, and
Shoot.
take them in whichever order you want. Which Amit, thank you, Amit, asked, do you think the government in Lebanon will actually manage to stop Hezbollah from existing there? And
Prophecy. I don't do prophecy.
I knew you would say that, but I'm still going to see. Hopefully, you give us something. I don't know. I'm going to push you in a second, if I can.
Go ahead. All right.
And the other
Look,
one is
I hope so. I hope so. I can't go beyond that. It's up to them. They're going to
right,
have to make the decisions.
right, and that's why you've taught us so much over the years, Elliot. You analyze, you don't predict. And will the government in Lebanon be able to? Is what you're saying is you hope so.
Yes.
Okay, so I was going to throw the other question at you, but so I guess you answered the first one. So let me get to the other one, which is why not disrupt Iran's infrastructure, including electrical grids and roads, to win the war?
First of all, it's not going to win the war. I think that it once again a calculation. I believe a miscalculation, but I'm going to be a little bit more reticent on this. A calculation on the part of the Americans that by threatening to do it, they might be able to bring the Iranians around. The Iranians hoodwinked them. They said, "No, no, please don't do it," and then they went on their merry way. The infrastructure threat, which may get carried out next week, I think has its primary purpose to break Iran up geographically into segments so that if there is an uprising in one area, the IRGC and the Basij will find it difficult to reinforce that area. And if a geographical area of Iran is liberated by an uprising, it will make it much more likely that it'll be able to spread successfully to the rest of the country.
Interesting. And last question, which is totally switching gears here, but there's a new death penalty law in Israel for terrorists. And do you think it'll be effective?
I don't think it'll be effective. I'm nominally in favor of it because I don't think that these people should be breathing the same air as we do. But I think that its overall effectiveness will be very, very limited because the number of terrorists who will ultimately be executed will not be that great. Just the nature of Western democracy. It will but at the same time give our adversaries and enemies grist for the mill. Everyone is going to be a martyr. They don't care that much about their own lives. And the idea of taking them off the future exchange list for hostage taking ignores the fact that even if we execute a whole bunch of them, we'll still be holding a whole bunch of them. And there'll always be an excuse to take hostages and say, we're going to exchange them for these or for those. So again, I'm not opposed to it. In general, I don't oppose the death penalty. I have issues with its application and implementation in some places like the United States. But as an overall principle, I'm not against it. I think it should also be mentioned that we already have the death penalty on the books in Israel, and it has only been used once,
Really?
Adolf Eichmann, but it's there. It has been imposed. In other words, the verdict, sentencing of death has happened numerous times throughout Israel's history against terrorists, and it was always commuted to life in prison.
I didn't realize it was actually on the books. I mean, we knew Eichmann is the one exception, but
No, it's on the books.
oh, okay. We always learn so much from you. Thank you, Elliot. Thanks for doing this. And thanks everyone
My
for being
pleasure.
here. It's important to stay up to date here and important to just keep following what is happening. And at the end of the day, our students on campus are faced with a lot of questions, and it's good to be able to come together and ask these questions, explore them a little more deeply together. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'll just make one announcement, which is that our next Hasbara mission to Israel is still happening, and we're going in May, in a month. So going in May, in June, and in August, and we don't give up even if there is a war. And so if you have students in your life, in your family, and they haven't been on a Hasbara mission to Israel yet, please encourage them. There is space, and many student missions to Israel are canceling for this summer with the war going on, but we're not in the business of doing that at Hasbara. So we're still going, and
I don't think
applications
I've
are.
gotten your dates yet. I don't think I've gotten your dates yet. So keep
No,
that in
you're not.
mind.
We're not on your calendar. Okay, all right,
I don't think I'm
we have to yell at someone. I don't know. We have our dates. We may not know exactly when we're coming to the north, but we
all
will
right.
iron it out.
Okay.
Thank you, Elliot, and thanks everyone.
Always a pleasure.